Hello everybody, I'm Blake Watson. I have always found vampires to be absolutely fascinating. They've been one of my main interests in life from the time that I was a little boy. I was obsessed with vampires. I dressed up as vampires. Every vampire movie that came out I wanted to go see. I have loved vampires my whole life. Now that I'm older, I find vampires equally fascinating, but in an entirely different manner. I find them intellectually fascinating, and I still have just as fiery as an interest in vampires as I did when I was a boy, but now I look at the history, I look at the myth, I look at the lore, and it's all absolutely amazing to me and entertaining. But more so than the lore, more so than any of this, I find the symbolic aspect of vampires to be absolutely incredible. In other words, I believe that vampires are an archetype. Now then, I do not wish to negate Carl Gustav Jung, who is my absolute hero. I've read all of his work. He's been my intellectual inspiration my whole life. But Carl Jung believed that vampires were not an archetype. They were not in and of themselves a symbol. Jung believed that they were a mythology, and he's not wrong in this. The vampire itself is a mythology, but in Jung's interpretation of the vampire, they were the mythology in which the archetype would manifest itself. In other words, the vampire was the container, was the glass, and the archetype was what was poured into the glass. And sometimes the vampire mythology could be a conduit for various types of archetypes. It's a matter of what was poured into it. But for the most part, I see the vampire itself not so much as a myth, even though it does play that role, but I see it more so as the archetype, the thing that fills the vessel, so to speak. Jung believed that the vampire motif, the vampire myth, was a conduit, a myth which represented the archetype of the shadow. Now, the Jungian aspect of the shadow means that darker side of ourselves, the more mischievous side of ourselves, the more diabolical side of ourselves, the part of us that we don't wish to express. It's our ruder, less polished, a little bit more evil and sinister side of ourselves, and we all have it. Carl Jung actually discussed on many times the significance of being aware of our shadow, because when we're unaware of our shadow, it controls us, it dominates us, and it comes out in very horrific forms. Alan Watts, who was very well studied in Jungian psychology, also talks about the fact that we need to integrate the shadow, because when a person has integrated the shadow, they're playful, they're harmlessly mischievous. But when a person has an unintegrated shadow, a repressed shadow, they become vile, sinister, diabolical, evil, and they do bad and horrific acts. So the shadow is a very significant part of our psychology according to the Jungian interpretation of psychology. And Carl Jung said that the vampire myth is a conduit for the shadow archetype. And I do believe that the vampire and the shadow archetype have a synonymous affair with each other. But I do not believe that it is solely a myth in which archetypes can manifest themselves. I instead believe that the vampire itself is an archetype. And I say this because it not only represents the shadow, is coinciding with what Carl Jung says, but it seems to represent a fear of our own mortality and a devastation which comes with grief. The vampire in and of itself seems to be a manifestation of these things, and the manifestation, of course, comes out in an archetypal format. So we see that the vampire hysteria really took place, even though it is a very archaic and primordial aspect. It really began to develop and really take hold around the Middle Ages, really flourishing in the time of plagues. Vampires and plagues became synonymous with each other, and all the vampire lore and mythology have vampires and illnesses, sickness and plagues and uncleanliness tethered together, inseparable from each other. So the vampire and illness, the vampire and death kind of happen around the same time. In the Middle Ages, death was omnipresent. It was everywhere. Every street corner had a vile atrocity associated with it. So the people were constantly exposed to death and dying. And in that, they had to reflect on their own temporality, their own mortality, the fact that they would die, and the fact that their loved ones were more than likely to die within their lifetime. They would experience loss and grief, in other words. So the fact that the vampire phenomenon developed at a very dark time in human history, a dark time very associated with plague, illness, and of course death, I think is significant for the aspect of death. And the fact that the vampires were considered undead, they were risen again from the grave. It was a reminder, so to speak, that death was an omnipresent reality, that it was something that we had to face, that it was a truth which stared us blatantly in the face. So that is why I think that the vampire is an archetype for our fear of death, that it is an embodiment or a manifestation of the terror we feel and the realization that we ourselves have to pass away and die at some point. Lastly, I believe that it is also a representation or an archetypal formation of grief. And I say this because vampires stereotypically would always return to their loved ones first and foremost, and they would drain them. The symptoms of vampiric attacks would be insomnia, night terrors, nightmares, so to speak. It would be, they would feel lethargic, they would feel depressed, they would feel melancholy, they would feel as if the life was being drained out of them. Now, if anybody's experienced grief, they will know firsthand that this is exactly what grief feels like. You can't sleep at night. You're haunted with nightmares. Grief is a stinging sensation, but it's a stinging sensation which leaves one tired, which depletes the energy out of one. It leaves one feeling exhausted, lethargic, as if life itself was being drained out of you. It also is very akin to fear. And a lot of people will not discuss this because perhaps they just don't have the poetic ability to discuss this. Not that I have the poetic ability by any means to discuss this, but one thing that people do not talk about is that grief feels very similar to fear. It is scary. It is horrifying. You don't know what lies around the corner, and you feel so cripplingly and utterly alone. All of these things seem to be synonymous with the vampiric phenomenon. So that is why I feel and I believe that the vampire is indeed an archetype not only of death and our fear of dying, but it is an archetypal expression of grief. That is why it returns to the family members. That is why it leaves such outstanding symptoms which are so similar to grief, because vampires are a symbol for death, dying, and grief. Of course, I'm going to discuss this in more detail in a video coming up very soon, which is the history of lore and mythology of vampires. So I hope that you catch that video for a little bit more in-depth look of what I'm talking about when discussing these vampiric phenomenon.